Did you guys have any questions about the Wilmot Proviso? All right, so you guys should be at the election of 1848. Any questions? I don't have internet access right now, so just hang tight at this point. Yeah, it's pretty annoying. All right, so we have the election of 1848. This is an interesting time for the Democrat and Whig Party. The Whig Party is divided into what were called conscious Whigs and what were called cotton Whigs. Conscious Whigs were more anti-slavery abolitionists. Cotton Whigs were more of the Southern Whigs who were tied to the slave system, but also industrial North textile Whigs who were in New York, Boston, and other textile cities in the New England region. So the two candidates that they looked at for running for president in the Whig Party, obviously Henry Clay was a fine option, but we know that Clay has not done too well running for president. There was also an idea of possibly running Old Fuss and Feathers, Winfield Scott from Dinwiddie County, but he was one of those guys that didn't always rub everyone the right way. So the choice was really a political outsider and kind of another dark horse candidate similar to the James K. Polk type, and that guy's going to be Zachary Taylor, aka Old Rough and Ready. He was a war hero at the Battle of Buena Vista, and he had a really interesting political background, and that was the fact that he had no political background. He couldn't really, he couldn't really offend too many people. Plus, he had roots to Virginia. He was related to James Madison. He was related to, his son-in-law was Jefferson Davis. So he, in the eyes of the Cotton Whigs, he appeared to be supporter of the slave South, and would be fine with the slave system spreading west. In the eyes of the North, he might back the Wilmot Proviso and prevent slavery from spreading west. Interestingly enough, the Whigs, the whole platform was try to stay away from the slavery issue as much as possible, but it was almost impossible to do so. Zachary Taylor, of the candidates in this particular race, did the best job of staying away from the slave issue. The Democrats, too, are a bit splintered. You've got what were considered barn burner Democrats who felt that they didn't really have a voice or a say, and they were leaning more toward the abolitionist movement. They start to sort of sway over to another party. Then you have your hardcore Southern Democrats who don't want to see the Wilmot Proviso pass and want to see the system of slavery spread to the West. They are going to find a candidate in Lewis Cass who is going to promote a very common theory that we're all familiar with, and that theory is popular sovereignty, which you guys have brought up. The idea that if you want to go out into a territory and vote for whether you want slavery or not, you can do so. The problem here is that the people that are going to vote for it are going to be white males over or 21 and over. So free African Americans don't have a say here. Women don't have a say. I mean, this is in and around the time of the Seneca Falls Convention, and and the push for the suffragettes, the women's suffrage movement at this period of time. So there is going to be a third-party movement, but this third-party movement already existed, and it was known as the Liberty Party. And the guy that had sort of led that Liberty Party movement was Salmon P. Chase. But the Liberty Party is going to sort of become kind of like the sacrificial lamb of what will become known as the Free Soil Party that Gavin had brought up before. That Free Soil Party kind of takes those barn burner Democrats, takes those Whigs on the fringe, takes those Liberty Party members, and takes all the abolitionists and bring them into one party movement. And the guy that they decide to run is former President Martin Van Buren. So the election poster of Zachary Taylor, Old Rough and Ready, and Millard Fillmore here on the right, this is a typical ticket of what a political party would have wanted. Zachary Taylor, Virginian by birth, connected, not politically, but by lineage to founding fathers, war hero, slave owner, plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana, and then Millard Fillmore of Buffalo, New York. So they're kind of appealing to both regions of the country. Hey, I know, and I fixed it for you. Yeah, that was my fault. Oh, on here or on yours?
No, like on the one you just had.
Oh.
You wrote 3.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'll fix that. All right, so Taylor wins. It's going to be, obviously, like I said, the Free Soil Party runs Van Buren. They get about 10% of the popular vote, no electoral votes. The slavery issue wouldn't disappear. Taylor, sort of in the minds of the Whig Party, is going to be sort of like a wolf in sheep's wool, because he's going to come out not long after he's elected and say, California needs to come in as a free state, New Mexico needs to come in as a free state. Remember, Utah, they're still not, no one's too keen on the Mormons coming in yet for statehood. So Taylor does keep the Mormons at bay for now. And remember, they'll apply for statehood later after the war. So this further divides the Whigs, and it really, in a way, is the beginning of the end of the Whig Party, because Taylor's not going to follow through with the Southern Cotton Whig agenda, or even the Cotton Whig agenda in the industrial parts of the North. This leads to a meeting in Jackson, Mississippi, that will ultimately result in the Nashville Convention. The Nashville Convention does a few things. It's a group of Whigs who will mostly become members of the Confederate States of America. It also is a meeting where the Fire Eaters, the more radical group, somebody who did the research on the Fire Eaters out there? Was that, yeah. So Jack talked to you about the Fire Eater movement that was born out of the Nashville Convention. Did you talk about the Nashville Convention, or did you talk about the Montgomery? Okay, so the Nashville Convention is a meeting set sort of like of the Whig Party to decide what direction are we going to go in. It eventually evolves into a party movement that we're going to learn about when we get to the election of 1860. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, so I'll talk a little bit more about that party movement a bit later. Taylor is also going to veto the founding father of the Whigs compromise, Henry Clay. And you guys know that compromise better as the Compromise of 1850. This is a bundle of bills that are sort of put together to try to appease the North, South, and the West as a result of the Mexican War and the Mexican Cession. So Taylor is willing to stand up against that and is not interested in passing a bill that is going to allow for popular sovereignty in the New Mexico Territory, nor a Fugitive Slave Act that would be punitive and further divide the nation. That doesn't make him an abolitionist, don't get me wrong. The man owned over 300 slaves. That was a significant number of slaves. I think it was somewhere between 300 and 400 were the amount of slaves Taylor owned on a couple of plantations. So here we see the Whig victory, Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore. Again, it's not, I mean, it wasn't a landslide by any means in either the Electoral College or the popular vote. You can see that the Free Soil Party a little bit, way far out of the race in terms of the electoral and the popular vote. All right, so origin of the Compromise of 1850. Again, this is an idea to sort of pacify North, South, East, and West. It is brought together by the triumvirate, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. By this period of time, though, all three of the Senate triumvirate, the Great Triumvirate, are not too far from the grave. In fact, this will be their last major compromise. The young buck that's coming up to carry on the triumvirate's momentum to keep the country out of war is Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, and Stephen Douglas becomes part of our lesson as we move forward. The original compromise, as I said before, was blocked by Taylor, but Taylor is going to suffer from a cholera outbreak that was in Washington, D.C. in 1850, and he will die in office during the time of this compromise. So the compromise is really going to be signed by President Millard Fillmore. Here's essentially what happens. California is wanting to come in as a free state. So the Compromise of 1850 will allow California to come in as a free state, which will tip off the balance, that 15 free, 15 slave balance. Furthermore, California demands that a railroad, a transcontinental railroad, be built. Okay? This means there's no potential slave state to offset California. Southerners see this as a threat because that means that the Wilmot Proviso may creep back into the picture again, even though a gag resolution had been passed to stop the any type of discussion of ending slavery in the South. We took a look at this image before. Some of the people that are in the mix here in this image: Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay. We see Millard Fillmore seated as vice president at the time, in charge of the Senate, and then Henry Clay standing. Also, Stephen Douglas is in there as well. So the compromise, what it actually looks like: California enters as a free state. The rest of the Mexican cession, New Mexico and Utah, will determine their statehood based on popular sovereignty. But we know that New Mexico and Utah are not going to apply for statehood until after the Civil War. The slave trade, not the practice of slavery, will be outlawed and abolished in Washington, D.C. A boundary dispute over West Texas, basically that right angle that you see along West Texas and New Mexico, that border dispute will be settled. There will be about $10 million in state debts that will be assumed by the federal government from the state of Texas. And in exchange for the imbalance and the fear that the Wilmot Proviso might creep into the picture again, are we all good with the Wilmot Proviso? Remember, that's the one that the proviso passed by, or attached to bills by David Wilmot, stating that slavery would not exist in any of the territory obtained in the Mexican cession. So to appease the Southern politicians who were disgruntled, the Fugitive Slave Act is passed. this is not the first time we've seen a fugitive slave law, right? We know that fugitive slave laws were on the books dating back to the late 1700s, early 1800s. But this particular act was extremely punitive and was deeply troubling to the North and many abolitionists. So here are some of the parts of the Fugitive Slave Act. Northern law enforcement were required to arrest runaways. Runaways could not defend themselves in court. Little evidence would be required to prove ownership. Agents and judges were paid more to send slaves back into the southern slave system, right? And in some cases, judges were paid double what they would have made to free a slave. Andrew.
How would they know? Like, what do you mean by northern law enforcement? I don't think there's really any kind of
agents. There are slave agents. There are agents, bounty hunters. There are marshals that are bound to pick up runaway slaves. Yeah. So a way for the North to combat that, and I added this note for you guys, they're going to start establishing laws to allow for slaves to receive jury trials in the North, but it wasn't everywhere. Yeah. This is another problem with this too, is that a lot of free African Americans, they're going to be captured, sold into slavery, and their papers proving their freedom will be destroyed. And there's very little protection or civil rights or even due process that they had to protect themselves. All right, so a little bit about, I got a map of the Compromise of 1850. California enters as a free state. Utah, New Mexico territory, popular sovereignty. This right here, that's your new boundary line. Texas state debts will be assumed by the federal government. The slave trade will be outlawed in Washington, D.C., and the Fugitive Slave Act will be enforced, meaning that runaway slaves will be returned to the slave South. All right, so here are some problems with the compromise. Popular sovereignty remained unclear for a couple of reasons. Number one, most of the people that were living in Utah were Mormons or Native Americans, and most of the people that were living in New Mexico were mestizos, Mexican, Native American, and a handful of other trappers, traders, and settlers. There was not a large American population, American population that was in a situation to immediately apply for statehood. In fact, the group that could have applied for statehood the fastest at this period of time would have been Mormons, but they're going to be blocked by Taylor, they'll be blocked by Fillmore, they'll be blocked by Pierce, they'll be blocked by Buchanan. In fact, the first president out of that group that says, I don't really want to do anything, I don't want to have to deal with Mormons, period, in this era, is going to be Lincoln, because there will be a small war that will be waged between federal troops and the Mormons out in Utah. So this idea of popular sovereignty was a little bit flimsy, a little bit controversial, because the people who would ultimately want to go out and decide this would have been slaveholders themselves. Basically, what is happening here is a prediction of what will come on the border of Kansas and Missouri. That pro-slavery people might flood out into the territory and say, yes, I want to bring my slaves with me and I want this to be slave territory. And free soilers may want to make their way out there as well. That's exactly what we're going to see happen on the border of Kansas and Missouri. Another issue with popular sovereignty is this. California does not want slavery. Like 9-to-1 people that were approached about the slave system said, not interested. Not interested in slavery. A lot of people know in the backs of their minds, Well, if California doesn't want slavery and the Mormons aren't practicing slavery, will people that apply for statehood in Utah and New Mexico actually want to follow through with it anyway? So this is a political crossroads over the issue of popular sovereignty. All right. Obviously, the new Fugitive Slave Act is quite punitive and also quite controversial. The South loved it. The North was not fond of it. Abolitionists absolutely despised it and hated it. In fact, it's a big reason, it's a big inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, that best-selling novel that we talked about before. Did I ever have you guys put me on the clock? All right, I'm keeping an ea on it. I got it. You did? No, I got a good eye on it here. No, we're good. I'm looking at it. I'm trying to keep it at about 25 minutes. The Underground Railroad's going to come about, which we talked about. Who researched the Underground Railroad? Yeah, Thomas. So we talked a bit about that. You know, obviously it's a network of abolitionists and runaway slaves who are trying to get slaves free from south to north. So images of the Underground Railroad. That takes us to the election of 1852 and Franklin Pierce's administration. Similar scenario from the last election. The Whigs are splintered. The Democrats are a bit splintered. But the Democrats are in far better shape than the Whigs at this point. By the time we get to this election, Taylor is dead. Clay is dead. Webster is dead. All of the major Whigs are now deceased. Okay? So the Democrats are going to run Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire, and his vice presidential candidate will be William Rufus King, which I added. So again, I know that's not on the notes that I gave you. William Rufus King. Does anybody know about William Rufus King? Okay. He is a Southerner. He's from the state of North Carolina. He went to Chapel Hill, and he was elected in the House from North Carolina and from the Senate in Alabama. This is another example of how these political parties want to try to get the sectional balance, get a northern candidate and a southern candidate. All right? The Whigs are going to actually nominate two Southerners, but it's hard to really pinpoint Winfield Scott as a true Southerner. He is from Dinwiddie County, Virginia, but he would identify more as a national candidate because what do we know about Winfield Scott? When I say Winfield Scott, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Maybe nothing, maybe something. Where do we talk about him before, or where have we learned about him before? Where? What ward? What ward does he march into? Yes, very good. He marches into Mexico City. The Mexican Wars, where we remember Winfield Scott from. Old Fuss and Feathers. Problem here, though, is that Winfield Scott is not, he is a national figure, but he's not Henry Clay. Okay? And he's also sort of like, I don't know, he's kind of past his prime. He put his foot in his mouth a lot of times publicly. He's also is not doing well health-wise. He could barely even get on a horse at this period of time. In fact, it was like a horrible mudslinging campaign where Pierce's people would say, how could Winfield Scott run for president? He's never run for anything. Because he was so out of shape at this period of time. All right? They do run another Southerner with him, another North Carolinian, another Chapel Hill grad, William Graham. Graham is going to be Southern Whig, a Cotton Whig, and this is a very interesting election. Not to get all nerdy and jacked up about the election of 1852, but this is narrowly close in the popular vote. but insanely lopsided in the Electoral College, which is, it's pretty crazy when we'll take a look at the breakdown here in a second. Pierce defends the Compromise of 1850, and the Free Soil candidate John P. Hale, who was anti-compromise, he's going to get even less popular vote and no electoral vote than Van Buren had in 48. Pierce wins because the Whig Party's fallen apart, and he supported the Compromise of 1850. That's the big reason that he is going to wind up in the White House. So at the very bottom, I added a note for you there. Northern states are going to pass personal liberty laws that will stop federal enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and allow for runaway slaves to receive a trial by jury. Clearly, this did not set well with everybody. A lot of people, especially Southerners, were crying foul here and saying that this was a violation of the Supremacy Clause and of the Constitution. So we got, check this out. Look how close the popular vote was. Look how lopsided the Electoral College was. 254 to 42.
Luckily, we don't have to deal with that problem anymore today.
Yeah, right, exactly. I was waiting for somebody to make a comment there. Here we have Franklin Pierce. Really, Franklin Pierce's main accomplishment in office is going to be the Gadsden Purchase.
Oh, was that the Continental Railroad?
Yeah. Are you all familiar with the Gadsden Purchase?
Yeah.
This particular purchase is this southern purchase along the border of Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona. Do you all know what this purchase was made to do?
It was for the Continental Railroad to help make it.
Very good. It was to build a railroad, not just to move people, but to also move gold, silver, and any other resources. Something to keep in mind here is that we had a gold rush out in California, right? And that's going to lead a lot of people to flowing out into the territory. It also is the gold rush is a big reason California is easily going to come in as a free state. But the thing that is going to really mar Pierce's time in office are a couple of things. The Austin Manifesto, which was the United States potentially annexing Cuba. This didn't happen, but it created some very divisive politics during the era, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss the election of 1860. And the main thing that will ruin his one term in office is going to be the KansasNebraska Act. Keep in mind, though, he had some real personal stuff going on. He and his family had gotten into a train accident and they lost their son. So, KansasNebraska Act. This is pushed for by Stephen Douglas, and the premise of this is to allow for popular sovereignty in the Kansas and Nebraska territory. Furthermore, Douglas wants to see a transcontinental railroad built from Chicago through the territory to California. So it is a win-win for Douglas, and he sees this as another opportunity to help bring together the Democratic Party. But what ultimately happens is what everybody feared might happen out in New Mexico or Utah, and that is once this act is passed, people start spilling into the border of Kansas and Missouri, and they're going to go to the ballot boxes with knives, swords, and guns ready to fight over the vote. And this vote goes back and forth 5 different ways till finally violence erupts in the events of Bleeding Kansas. Any questions about that? Yeah. A lot. So there were this was very common. Boiler explosions on steamboats, trains, derailment. There's not steel rails yet. Iron rails were quite flimsy. Lots of train accidents. So even though you're looking at legit time travel in this era, it was very dangerous to travel on trains and steamboats this period of time. And train derailments were very common. No, the train derailed and they lived and he died. Yeah, very sad. So here's the little giant, Stephen Douglas, who brokers the Kansas and Nebraska Act. This is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Basically, it does away with the Missouri Compromise, allowing for people to go in and vote, whether they want slavery or not. And the violence will occur here on the border of Missouri and Kansas, mostly Lawrence, Kansas, in this area. So, this is the last thing that I'm going to discuss for now. We're going to take a break here. Bleeding Kansas in the election of 1856. Obviously, pro-slavery ruffians and free soil jayhawkers are going to go out into the territory to stake their claim and to apply for statehood. As previously mentioned, the people show up at the ballot box armed. The vote for free versus slave flip-flops back and forth about 5 different times, and it erupts into violence that really is more just terrorism than it was for true politics, because a lot of those people that were attacking cities and or not cities, but towns and settlements, were not doing it for a political cause, even though they might have been pro-slavery. Quantrill and his gang, they were attacking to try to line their own pockets and terrorize people in the area, right? Whereas John Brown at Pottawatomie Creek, he was fighting for a bit of a different cause. He was fighting for abolitionism and did so by bashing in the heads of 5 pro-slavery supporters along Pottawatomie Creek. So there are different motives here. Nonetheless, 56 people die in the events, almost including the death. Like about 200 were missing, killed, wounded as a result of Bleeding Kansas. Many historians will say these were the original battles of the American Civil War, and it heightened. I want to point out Davis did a good job of talking about the importance of St. Louis. We're going to talk about the mobs and raids in St. Louis early in the war. We're also going to be talking about an early battle out in this area called the Battle of Wilson's Creek. So there's going to be an entire theater of war that is not largely forgotten about, but it's a footnote compared to what we sort of think about, because when we think Civil War battles, where do we think? Yes, you guys just backed me up. Manassas, Gettysburg, Jackson and his family visited Antietam several times. Those come to mind because so much of the war occurred in the East, right? And there's a lot of battles that occurred in the West, but when we talk about trans-Mississippian battles, there's just not as many battles. There are a lot of these smaller skirmishes. And we need to keep in mind that some of the earliest skirmishes or small battles that occurred in the trans-Mississippian west of the Mississippi region were several years before the war began. So this is a good place to pump the brakes for now. This is an image of the event of Bleeding Kansas. Again, I told you there was a major feature film on the Bleeding Kansas conflict known as Ride with the Devil with Tobey Maguire. Any questions here? All right.